He was forced to marry a veiled woman in an arranged marriage. He thought he was the victim. But when the veil fell, he realized the scariest part wasn't. The dinner unfolded in what could be called elegance and decorum, where even the clink of cutlery against plates seemed programmed to avoid disturbance. Ethan Blake, 29, heir to the Blake & Co. real estate empire, sat at the head of the long, silk-draped table, staring at the cold slab of beef in front of him. He hadn't touched it, not hungry, not interested. Nothing could make him swallow the future being forced down his throat. "This marriage has been agreed upon by both sides," his father said, his tone as calm as if discussing a stock investment. "The Whitman family holds strategic standing. You marry Sophie, and we solidify our ties. Simple." Ethan's lips twitched into a smirk. Simple indeed, except I'm not a stock. His mother, a woman whose face remained as expressionless as an oil painting, adjusted the napkin at her chest. "Don't flaunt your emotions like a child. This is duty, Ethan. Everyone has their part in protecting the family's reputation." "And what's my part?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with fire. "To play the puppet in a tuxedo and marry a girl who'll wear a veil through the entire ceremony?" His father set down his wine glass. A faint sound, but it rang like a command. "She has her reasons, and you don't need to love her. Just respect her." Ethan let out a laugh, a short, bitter burst. "Respect someone whose face I've never seen? A transaction wrapped in a wedding tied with hollow vows?" No one answered. No one needed to. The decision had been made long before he had a chance to object. They didn't need his agreement, just his presence, on time, without embarrassing the family. Ethan stood, his chair scraping against the marble floor, as jarring as the room's artificial silence. "Fine," he said, his gaze slicing through his parents like a cold blade. "If this is what you call family, then I've been wrong about that word for a long time." He left the room, abandoning the false grandeur and the ticking of the antique clock that seemed to underscore the control he'd never escaped. Upstairs, he poured a full glass of whiskey and stood by the window. The city outside glittered, but all he felt was cold. His eyes lingered on the darkness beyond the balcony, where a woman he'd never met was about to enter his life, not out of love, not by choice, but because he lacked the power to defy the mandate called duty. He took a sip. It burned, but not enough to scorch the simmering anger coiling in his chest. Tomorrow he would meet Sophie Whitman, his veiled bride, and Ethan swore, if he was being forced into this game, he'd play it on his own terms. Ethan Blake expected nothing but a dreary Monday, like every other Monday since he'd been thrust into this arranged marriage. The same oversized mahogany desk, larger than his old childhood bedroom, the same light filtering through thick silk curtains as if the office itself was weary of its own existence. And then she walked in, without knocking. "Good morning," Sophie Whitman said, her voice as calm as if she were the only one with the right to come and go in this building. She wore a pale blue dress, so simple it almost defied the standards of high society, and as always, the delicate veil still covered half her face. Ethan didn't look up. "What do you want? Here to remind me how many days it's been since we married for convenience?" Sophie didn't react. Instead, she walked straight to his desk and placed a folder in front of him. "You're handling the Cartwright deal, aren't you?" Her tone wasn't probing. It was a statement. Curious, Ethan flipped through a few pages. Handwritten notes lined the margins of the contract, suggestions for revised clauses, a few critical points he hadn't even noticed yet. He looked up, narrowing his eyes. "When did you read this?" "Over the weekend," she replied with a shrug, "while you were busy avoiding the family meet and greet." "Impressive," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't know there was a brain that could read financial contracts behind all that lace." "Not a brain, just interest," she shot back, her eyes holding his gaze. "No one forced me to understand your work, but if we're stuck living together, I'm not planning to be a decorative piece." Ethan fell silent, just for a moment, but long enough to feel something shift, something veering off the track he thought he controlled. "And you?" she continued. "Are you going to keep pretending for the rest of your life that I'm just an inconvenience wrapped in white lace?" Her question hit something in him. Not pain, but a movement, subtle, like a pebble dropping into a lake, sending quiet ripples outward. "Maybe I never thought you cared," Ethan said, using "you" in a way that slipped out unconsciously for the first time. "I figured you were just content to sit in the castle and let people guess whether you actually exist." Sophie stepped back, her hand brushing the armrest of a chair. "Then maybe it's time you stop imagining and start looking," she laughed. Not rushed, not dramatic, just the faint scent of jasmine lingering with the folder full of annotated notes. Ethan stared after her, his hand still resting on the papers. His eyes didn't leave the door she'd just closed, and for the first time since the wedding he wasn't entirely sure who was the one hiding behind the veil. The scent of buttery pastries and soft vanilla lingered in the air like a whisper. The kitchen on the lower floor of the Blake mansion was as quiet as usual, save for the faint clatter of utensils and a small burst of laughter, like sunlight slipping through morning curtains. Ethan froze in the doorway, on his way to the garage but halted by a sound he wasn't used to. Sophie's laughter, not the polite, restrained chuckle of social gatherings, nor the discreet giggle from family meetings. This was real, gentle, unhurried, with no need to hide. She sat on a kitchen stool, her hand lightly lifting the thin veil to one side, not fully, just enough to reveal a fleeting smile, clear as dew on glass. Across from her was Margaret, the Blake family's longtime chef, scooping the last of the batter into tart molds. "How'd you know my family's recipe still uses old-fashioned custard powder?" Margaret asked, her hands moving deftly. "The scent," Sophie replied, her voice soft, like sharing a private story. "Old vanilla always has a deeper tone than the new kind. Few notice, but it says a lot." Margaret laughed, nodding as if someone had finally understood her after years of cooking in silence. A young staff member nearby handed Sophie a paper towel to wipe her hands. She didn't miss thanking him with a sincere glance, enough to make the boy duck his head, flustered. Ethan gripped the doorframe lightly, careful not to make a sound. He'd never seen a scene like this. A woman, his wife, legally speaking, sitting in the kitchen as if it belonged to her. But there was no possessiveness, no calculation, just a presence that made people breathe slower. She didn't need to give orders, didn't need to feign friendliness, yet everyone there, people he'd always assumed followed only commands, gravitated toward her quietly, like sunflowers turning to the sun. Sophie leaned over the first tart. "I think the top needs a touch less sugar. If the caramel layer's thin, the raspberry jam's tartness will stand out. Kids usually love that." "You have children?" someone asked. She shook her head slightly. "Not yet. But I was a child raised on kind pastries." Ethan stepped back, slipping away from the doorway. His jacket brushed the cool stone wall, a stark contrast to the strange warmth blooming in his chest. He'd once thought Sophie was an enigma, but now it seemed everyone in this house, except him, had already found a piece of the answer. And he realized some people don't need to claim someone's heart to touch it. They just need to be there, long enough, quiet enough, and real enough. The rain fell steadily, like a wordless melody tapping lightly against the glass windows. The mansion grew darker with only the faint glow of hallway lamps and the reading light in the western library. Ethan sat alone in that room, his shirt still buttoned at the collar, his tie loosened but not fully undone. On the desk lay an unsigned contract, and beside it a novel he'd once planned to read as a student. The title had faded, but it had never left the shelf. Outside, the wind slipped through the door's cracks like the long sigh of a nameless day. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. The house seemed to sink into sleep with only him awake. As usual, then the heavy wooden door creaked open. No knock. It was Sophie. She stepped in with a stride as light as the night breeze. In her hands was a simple wooden tray, a cup of tea, a neatly folded gray towel, and a small slice of pastry. No explanation, no invitation. She set the tray on the low table near his armchair and turned to leave, as if her presence there was only to quietly add a touch of warmth to the cold night. "You don't sleep?" Ethan asked, his voice rough from hours of silence. Sophie paused but didn't look at him. "I heard the rain. Sometimes. It's okay not to sleep." He nodded, though she didn't see. A part of him didn't want her to go, but he also didn't know how to keep someone close when he hadn't yet dared to open his own heart. "I didn't think you knew I come here," he said after a pause. Sophie's gloved fingers brushed the armrest of a chair. "I didn't. But I guessed." Then she smiled, faintly, and walked away. Ethan watched her go, the door closing without a sound. He looked down at the tray. Steam rose in delicate wisps, the chamomile's gentle scent like a hand resting on his forehead in a moment of weariness. He picked up the towel, his fingers tracing its edge. There was a faint scent, dry pine wood, and a hint of familiar soap. The night hadn't passed. The rain still fell. But for the first time in weeks, in the familiar solitude, Ethan felt a quiet easing in his chest. Not because of words, not because of some grand gesture, but because someone had thought of him in the simplest way. A cup of tea in the dead of night and a towel set out for him. Perhaps this was what it felt like to exist in someone's care, without it needing a name. The meeting took place in the conference room on the 17th floor, a space Ethan frequented like a cog in a machine. The glass walls framed a gray cityscape, mirroring the tension within. On the table, drafts of the partnership plan with the Dunley Group were spread out like a strategic chessboard, awaiting someone to make the decisive move. "We need to accelerate the timeline if we want to meet next quarter's deadline," the head of investments pressed. "Research costs can be adjusted later." Ethan listened, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. He was about to speak when a female voice, soft, clear, cut through from the corner of the room, where Sophie sat as a quiet fix. "If we rush the timeline, we risk losing the technical support commitment from our Korean partner. I reviewed the contract's annex. There's a minor clause about the testing process. Skipping it could open us to litigation." The room stilled for a moment. All eyes turned to Sophie, not because she was wrong, but because no one expected her to speak. Ethan leaned slightly toward her. "You're sure?" His tone wasn't sharp, just tempered with surprise. Sophie nodded, her gaze steady on the printed document. "I cross-checked all 3 contract versions. Clause 4.2b, Technical Implementation Section. I marked it if you need to verify." An assistant hurriedly opened a laptop. Within seconds, the confirmation flashed on the large screen. The seemingly trivial wording now stood as the linchpin shifting the entire discussion. Ethan leaned back in his chair, hands clasped across his chest. He looked at Sophie, this time with a different gaze. "So, what do you suggest we do?" he asked, his voice lower. Sophie didn't falter. "Instead of cutting the process short, focus on optimizing internal logistics. Speed up the areas we control, not the ones dependent on partners. That way we can still meet the overall timeline without breaching the clause." Another pause, but no longer tense, just acknowledgement. One of the directors gave a slight nod. "Reasonable proposal." Ethan scanned the room, then he turned to Sophie, saying slowly, "Noted. We'll proceed with the optimization plan as you suggested." The meeting continued, but the atmosphere had shifted. No one looked at Sophie as just the arranged wife anymore. She had stepped out of the shadows. When the meeting ended, Ethan packed his laptop deliberately. Before leaving the room, he glanced at Sophie, who was gathering her drafts. In that moment, for the first time, he admitted to himself, perhaps he had misjudged this woman from the very start. The afternoon descended on the garden like a delicate veil of late sunlight, filtering evenly through the leaves and scattering across the pebbles along the winding path. The lavender bushes swayed gently in the breeze, carrying a soft fragrance like the earth's quiet whisper. In the distance, bird song rose steadily, a familiar classical melody that hearts are always ready to hear. Ethan stepped into the garden on a rare afternoon free of meetings or urgent plans to review. There was only silence and a vague sense of peace. He expected nothing, simply wanting to sit on the stone bench near the bougainvillea trellis, a place he'd passed countless times but never truly paused at. But this time, Sophie was there. She sat quietly, a closed book in her hands, her gaze fixed on the shimmering sky between the branches. No makeup, no unease, just a serene presence that radiated an odd familiarity. Hearing his footsteps, she tilted her head and smiled. "I hope I'm not taking your usual spot." Ethan shook his head, walking slowly to sit on the bench across from her. "I've never had a usual spot in this garden. Honestly, I've never made a habit of stopping. So, today's the first time? Maybe." A gentle silence drifted between them. The breeze stirred a few petals, letting them fall onto the stone table. Sophie caught one, studying it as if reading an old poem. "I've always loved this place," she said, her voice soft as a breath. "It's peaceful, like the world isn't demanding anything from you." Ethan nodded faintly. "I'd forgotten how to feel it." They sat like that, no need to fill the air with words, letting the quiet soothe the chaos that usually surrounded them. Occasionally, Sophie spoke of a plant, a poem she'd read, or a funny moment with the gardener. Ethan listened, not interrupting. He realized she had a way of making things come alive without effort. Around her, emotions felt allowed. "I'm not good at talking like you are," Ethan admitted as the sunlight began to fade behind the bougainvillea. "Not good at sharing or listening to gentle things." Sophie turned to him, smiling. "I don't need you to be good at it, just real." A simple sentence, but it lingered in the air like a clear note ringing out after a long silence. They left the garden as the sky turned purple. No promises, no plans, but Ethan knew, from that afternoon on, he'd found something new, a companion, undefined yet undeniably present. The firelight from the hearth flickered in the corner of the room, like the steady breathing of memory. Golden-orange rays cast shadows on the wooden walls, forming vague shapes as if time were flowing backward to some ancient realm. Ethan sat in the armchair, holding a mug of hot cocoa that Sophie had made herself, the faint scent of cinnamon soothing every sense. On the wooden table before him lay an old book, its spine worn and a few pages slightly curled as though it had been carried through long journeys. "This was my mom's," Sophie said, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear as she sat beside him. "She read it over and over when I was a kid. Whenever I was sad, she'd pull it out and read the pages in a soft voice, like a lullaby." Ethan glanced at the book's cover. It was an old novel, not famous, not flashy, just a simple story about a girl living by the sea and letters never sent. "I kept it for the notes in the margins," Sophie continued, her voice almost a whisper. "My mom wrote in them. Some are funny, some are sad, and some have nothing to do with the story, just random bursts of thought." Ethan flipped a page. In the margin, written in slanted blue ink, "Happiness is sometimes a warm scarf at just the right moment." He gave a small smile, a kind of truth so simple it was almost disarming. "Do you have anything you've held on to from the past?" Sophie asked, not pressing, just a question let loose into the warm air. Ethan fell silent. In his mind, an image flashed, a battered tin box where he kept a few unsent letters, some photos, and a scrap of paper with a scrawled note. "You'll make it. I believe in you." "Yeah," he replied softly. "A box full of things that seem meaningless, but I can't bring myself to throw away." Sophie nodded. "I get it. Those little things, sometimes they're the only things that tether us to ourselves." The hearth crackled. Outside, the winter wind whistled through the trees, a faint hum like a quiet soundtrack. Inside the room, there was only the sound of turning pages and the soft breathing of two people sitting side by side. No need for too many words. Ethan spoke quietly, eyes still on the book. "If you could relive one memory, just once, what would it be?" Sophie thought for a moment, then answered, A winter night, lying in my mom's arms while she read this book, I remember her voice when she paused, looked up and said, "Sophie, you don't need to become anything grand, just live deeply and truly." Ethan looked at her, the firelight reflecting in both their eyes like a quiet but steadfast glow, and he understood that tonight, with this book and a fragment of untouchable memory, they had taken a step together, not toward love, but toward sincerity. It was late, and the lights in the yard had dimmed to mere flickers, like the last fireflies of the season. Ethan and Sophie sat on the long bench on the back porch, where the wooden planks had worn smooth with time. A gentle breeze drifted under the eaves, carrying the scent of jasmine mixed with the earthy smell of the ground after an early rain. Both were quiet. Not the tense kind of silence, but the stillness of two people who had grown used to sharing without words. Sophie held a mug of ginger tea, her hands lightly pressed against it for warmth. Ethan stared into the darkness ahead, his voice low, as if letting himself slip into something he'd long hesitated to ask. "I want to ask you something. You don't have to answer if it feels uncomfortable." Sophie turned to him, tilting her head slightly. "Go ahead." "Why did you agree to marry me?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "From the start, knowing it was an arrangement, you still said yes. Why?" A brief pause stretched between them, as if the wind itself were waiting for her reply. Sophie didn't answer immediately. She set the mug down, her hands clasping together, her gaze drifting to the distance where stars glimmered faintly. "At first," she said carefully, "I thought it was duty. An arrangement that made sense. My family needed stability. They thought you could provide that. And I thought I could accept it." Ethan nodded slightly, unsurprised, but Sophie wasn't finished. "But then there was something else, something I've never said out loud." She turned to look at him. For the first time, her gaze didn't waver, didn't hold back. It was clear and steady, like the surface of an undisturbed lake. "I said yes because I saw something in you, something you didn't even see in yourself back then. A man trying so hard to prove he didn't need anyone, but deep down, waiting for someone to see his vulnerability and not walk away." Ethan froze. "I've been that person," Sophie whispered. "And I know that look, the way you hide behind curt words, furrowed brows, and long nights awake alone. I didn't know if I could change anything, but I wanted to be there. At the very least, to prove that not everyone leaves when they see the most fragile parts." Ethan couldn't speak. His throat tightened. In that moment, all the assumptions, doubts, and distance between them seemed to melt away. He reached for her hand, not tightly, just enough to hold on. A small gesture, but it carried a silent promise. "Thank you for staying," he wanted to say, but the words didn't come, and Sophie smiled, as if she'd heard it in the trembling silence between their intertwined hands. The dinner party that evening was held at one of Manhattan's most luxurious hotels, a place where the elite gathered not just to celebrate, but to size each other up with glances, words, and icy handshakes. Ethan entered with Sophie, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She wore a long emerald green dress, elegant but understated, still that same simplicity, that quiet reluctance to draw attention. But her gaze was different now. Deeper, steadier, knowing the man beside her wasn't just standing with her but was ready to stand for her. A few soft laughs drifted from a group of women near the bar. Whispers, half joking, half venomous, slipped easily through the walls of prestige. "Who is she? Looks plain, doesn't she? Doesn't seem to match Ethan at all. I heard it was arranged. Maybe he's been blindfolded too long to notice." The final ripple of giggles was the spark that stopped Ethan in his tracks. He looked at Sophie. She still wore a faint smile, as if long accustomed to such remarks. But he wasn't, not anymore. Ethan turned, walking straight toward the group who now feigned ignorance. His voice rang out, not loud but sharp enough to silence the room. "If you're curious," he said, eyes unflinching, Allow me to introduce her properly." The silence stretched so taut you could hear the faint clink of ice in glasses. "This is Sophie Whitaker, my wife, the smartest, strongest, and kindest woman I've ever known. She doesn't need a glittering gown or empty flattery to make me proud to stand beside her." A man tried to laugh it off, but Ethan turned to him, his gaze hardening. "And if anyone still feels entitled to comment on someone else's appearance or choices," he said slowly, each word carved like stone, "they might want to look in the mirror before stepping into a place like this." Sophie stood still behind him, but her eyes shimmered with something long held back. Not surprise, but a profound gratitude. Not because she'd been defended, but because, for the first time, Ethan had taken her side before the world, unhesitating, unguarded, no longer hiding the pride he felt as he once had. After a few awkward seconds, the group dispersed quietly. Ethan turned back, walking to Sophie, tension still etched in his brow, but his eyes softened. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for not having the courage to speak up before." Sophie shook her head gently. "You just did something not everyone would dare to do." Ethan looked at her, his hand tightening slightly around hers. "From now on, you'll never have to stand alone again. I promise." And for the first time in his life, that promise wasn't spoken to reassure someone else. It was to affirm one truth. The old Ethan was gone. The gala ended with the glow of crystal chandeliers and applause echoing through the hall. But for Ethan, everything truly began. "Courage to trust what I wasn't used to." She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a sad melody rising from far away. "I don't need forgiveness," Ethan went on. "Just a chance. One chance. To love you the right way. Not because you're my wife, but because you're you." Sophie stepped closer, her footsteps soft as a whisper. She touched his hand, for the first time without the familiar barrier of gloves. "I'm not angry," she said. "I was only afraid you'd never let yourself grow. And now? Maybe you're starting to." That moment needed no flowers or fireworks. Just two people standing beneath an open sky, quietly reborn from what they thought had shattered. After the gala, Sophie stopped wearing a veil, not because she had changed, but because Ethan saw her with new eyes. They began again, from the smallest things, drinking tea together in the morning, reading books on the porch, discussing company plans that now bore the shape of both their dreams. One day, as they passed through the hallway where they'd first met after their wedding, Ethan paused. He turned to her, smiling. "I used to call this an arranged marriage. Now I call it luck." Sophie laughed, light as an early breeze. "Just remember, this luck came because you learned to see with your heart, not your eyes." They walked on, slowly but surely. No one hid anymore. No one walked away from unfinished dreams, and in a world full of relationships born from prejudice, they were living proof of something miraculous, that sometimes loving someone isn't about them changing, it's about learning to see them differently. Some stories leave us speechless, not because of the final twist, but because of the heart's transformation along the way. Thank you for joining Millionaire and Heart Stories. We hope today's story touched the deepest part of your soul.